Attention! Fight! Be seated.
When were so-called Americans legally identified, classified, and thereafter referred to as either black or white people?
Wake up, nigga.
Who were the social engineers that consolidated the multiplicity of nationalities in the world to only two groups, known today as black people or white people?
Wake up, nigga.
What was the purpose for reconstruction of the legal identity and classification of men as either black people or white people, regardless of their historical nationality? The truth will shock you.
Wake up, nigga.
I was wondering about our yesterdays and digging through the rubble. And to say the least, somebody went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that when we looked things up, we wouldn't fare too well. And we would come up with totally unreliable pictures of ourselves. But I've compiled what few facts I could, such as they are, to see if we could find out a little bit of something. And this is what I got so far.
The social architects responsible for creating a race-based classification of men as either white or black occurred before Charles Darwin was born. Therefore, Darwin's non-scientific race theory that declares the superior evolution of white people was not a consideration of the men who divided the world into black and white. Nor could the religion of Christianity have been a motivating factor to the men who conceived the world as black and white. The social architects who asserted people can only be identified as either white or black declared white-skinned people are by nature superior to black-skinned people, and accordingly granted absolute power only to white people. Therefore, Christianity could not have been a motive for identifying people as either black or white, because the Bible describes Jesus, the Christ, as a black man.
They were all black men.
Isaac. Jacob.
What is the real reason for the division of humanity as either black or white in the Western Hemisphere? The historical narratives disseminated by white European elitists regarding the above questions have proven to be inconsistent with historical facts. A half-truth is only another version of a lie. What has been endorsed and promoted as American history is not an accurate representation of historical facts, but rather a mischievous and misleading account of, quote, his story, end quote. The real reason why all nationalities on earth were classified as either white people or black people will shock the conscience of the average miseducated American. How, why, and when the false ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority was introduced in America has been hidden from the public with the same degree of care given to nuclear bomb codes. Both so-called black and white people have been indoctrinated to believe an untrue version of what happened in the past. American citizens are victims of indoctrination and misinformation. Exactly who, why, and when was the fallacy of white racial superiority and black racial inferiority adopted as a belief system? When was it? The assertion of white supremacy is not a 19th century declaration, nor is the assertion of white supremacy an objective scientific conclusion of social scientists or any academic society. We all have been intentionally deceived, misled, and maliciously taught white skin color is a natural biological indicator of intellectual and physical supremacy. That is, an act of God. However, a critical critique of historical facts clearly reveals who, when, and why the fallacy of white racial superiority was conceived. Clearly, the fallacy of white supremacy is not a belief system established upon godly precepts. The classification of black people as perpetual chattel slaves by white European elitists has resulted in the descendants of chattel slaves losing all remembrance of their true nationality, religion, language, and identity. Although white European slaves, who are now referred to as white people, escaped the ungodly sentence of being classified as perpetual chattel slaves, men and women belonging to the category of so-called white people, quote, a category created by white European elitists, end quote, also over time lost any remembrance of their true historical past and how they inherited their present belief system known as white supremacy. As the evidence will show, both black and white people were slaves who belonged to white European elitists, and equally victims of an insidious psychological trick. Irrefutable historical facts show before the ideology of white racial superiority and black racial inferiority was conceived, only one working class of people existed. This one working class was composed of both black and white people who were victims of a diabolical scheme that only benefited a rich European ruling class. The following evidence provides hidden historical facts omitted from history books that describe the origin and causation of contemporary racial hatred between so-called black and white Americans, to the shame and disgrace of degenerate white European elitists who divided the world into black and white people for their personal financial interests. A true account of what happened in the past requires removal of, quote, his history, end quote. In the end, God is not mocked. This is what the record shows.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? It's time for the final countdown. The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's rock.
Forget everything you've seen on television and in the movies. There's not going to be any last-minute surprise witnesses. Nobody's going to break down on the stand with a tearful confession. You're going to be presented with a simple fact. It is up to you to sift through layer upon layer of truth until you determine for yourselves which version sounds the most true.
Whiteness, as we understand it, race, as we understand it, didn't exist. That may be hard to understand now because it's so prevalent. Everybody seems to have a race. But race actually came into being, and we can trace that being.
For the first 100 years of the English attempting to colonize in North America, if you read all their laws for the first 100 years, you will not see a single person called a white person. It's only in 1681 when we see for the very first time anyone in these English laws referred to as a white person.
Your Uncle Sam. And this is the great American game.
And there's a reason for it. It came about following this massive rebellion. And up until this time, those from Africa and from England who worked on the same plantation, they were treated the same. They worked together, they ate together, they slept together, they married regularly. There were free people of African descent. Free Black men could run for public office. I found 3 in Virginia who did and held public office. Free Black men could own European indentured servants and indentured servants of African descent, and a few even claimed some as indentured for life or enslaved.
Much of the formation of how we think about race came out of the New World, that is, when people came to the Americas from Europe. And there were people from Africa, and there were people from Europe, and there were the elites. And of course there were the people who were already here, the native people. And the elites tried to organize the people from Africa, the workers from Europe, indentured servers, and the native people to actually control them, to extract resources from them. And at some point, the people from Africa and the people from Europe decided to make common cause. They lived together, they worked together, they intermarried, they had children. It wasn't perfect, but there probably was much more what we would call interracial contact then than there is now. And it didn't seem odd at all.
This is Unwritten Truths, a 500-year breakdown of how white supremacy poisoned the world. In the 1500s, they arrived with Bibles and swords, preaching salvation while stealing souls.
And so that was life up and through this massive rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion.
And at some point, it occurred to them that, look, we're doing all the work. We have no control over our lives. So there's this rebellion called the Bacon Rebellion, where they rebelled against the elite. And they demanded land, and they demanded greater democracy. They demanded a right to participate in the governance of the colony. And the elites rejected that. And this rebellion, and the rebellion was quite successful, called the Bacon Rebellion.
The rebellion consisted of people from Africa and from Europe side by side, wielding rebellion against the ruling elite.
The elites responded by saying, look, we have too many workers, and if they work together in a common cause, it's going to be hard to manage them. So they tried to experiment with separating the Africans and Europeans. And it took them almost 100 years. They tried religion, they tried language, they tried place of origin, and they stumbled upon race. Now they couldn't start with race because race didn't exist. So they couldn't just think of it. They had to experiment. And they start passing new laws like anti-miscegenation laws. And they told the now newly minted whites that your role is to identify with the elites. You're not an elite yourself, but you should identify with the elites, and you should police the non-whites. And they create slave patrols. But also they created a new identity, white identity. It had not existed before. And the white identity was that middle stratum, that stratum of identifying with the elites and controlling the non-whites.
The ruling elite in Virginia said to the legal oversight authority over in London, they said, don't worry, we have this under control. And they indicated that their plan was to pursue a divide and conquer strategy.
Oh, pause for a second, because as anyone, please go down the rabbit hole, Bacon's Rebellion. But you think about Nathaniel Bacon as like Fred Hampton, who understood the power of bringing all folk together. So there was an alliance between the mostly Irish, European indentured servants, the Africans who were enslaved from that 1619 to 20 some odd Negroes, you know, that became a thing. There were also indentured Africans and other Blacks, right? In different classes. It was a way of bringing everybody together.
When Black people wake up and become intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, as other humans are intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, then the Black man will think like a Black man, and he will feel for other Black people. And this new thinking and feeling will cause Black people to stick together. And then at that point, you'll have a situation where when you attack one Black man, you are attacking all Black men. And this type of Black thinking will cause all Black people to stick together. And this type of thinking also will bring an end to the brutality inflicted upon Black people by white people. And it is the only thing that will bring an end to it.
And Bacon's Rebellion scared the English ruling elite. It lasted well over a year. They burned Richmond to the ground. They slaughtered the indigenous people surrounding the colony. That was sort of the first phase of the rebellion, but the second phase focused on the ruling elite. And they actually, the ruling elite in Virginia fled onto a ship in the river, in the James River, where they stayed for months until the English sent in troops and quashed the rebellion.
And it's important in terms of saying this, that the elites didn't think of themselves as white. Yes, they were Europeans. What they thought of themselves were the elites. And because there had been this history where whites were so close to what was then Blacks, there's always a fear that you might fall back into that space. So there's always this anxiety. An early definition of whites were defined in terms of not being Black. It was a negative definition. Interesting, the Bacon Rebellion, Bacon himself was white, but it became known as a rebellion driven by Blacks because they were trying to create a sense of Blackness being scary and somehow a threat to whiteness. What's important in terms of this history is that whiteness itself never was the top dog. There was always the elites. So when we look at understanding race today and the economy, we sometimes think in terms of whites and non-whites, or whites and Blacks, Latinos, others. And it has some currency, that's real. But missing from that formulation are the role of the elites. And the colonies, Virginia being the most important, was a corporation. So Virginia was literally owned by a corporation and governed by a corporation for the crown to extract as much resources as possible from people, from land. And to some extent, that formulation we still live with today, even though it's been updated.
So when that rebellion was finally quashed, was finally put down, once they put down Bacon's Rebellion, that the way in which they were going to make sure that that rebellion or anything like it never happens again is this divide and conquer strategy.
Wake up, nigga.